Book 1, Chapter 10 of On the Education of an Orator, by Quintilian, translated by H.E. Butler. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. I have made my remarks on this stage of education as brief as possible, making no attempts to say everything, for the theme is infinite, but confining myself to the most necessary points. I will now proceed briefly to discuss the remaining arts in which I think boys ought to be instructed before being handed over to the teacher of rhetoric, for it is by such studies that the course of education described by the Greeks as enkyklaios paideia, or general education, will be brought to its full completion. For there are other subjects of education which must be studied simultaneously with literature. These, being independent studies, are capable of completion without a knowledge of oratory, while on the other hand they cannot by themselves produce an orator. The question has consequently been raised as to whether they are necessary for this purpose. What, say some, has the knowledge of the way to describe an equilateral triangle on a given straight line got to do with pleading in the law courts or speaking in the Senate? Will an acquaintance with the names and intervals of the note of the lyre help an orator to defend a criminal or direct the policy of his country? They will perhaps produce a long list of orators who are most effective in the courts, but have never sat under a geometrician, and whose understanding of music is confined to the pleasure which their ears, like those of other men, derive from it. To such critics I reply, and Cicero frequently makes the same remark in his Orator, that I am not describing any orator who actually exists or has existed, but have in mind an ideal orator, perfect down to the smallest detail. For when the philosophers describe the ideal sage, who is to be consummate in all knowledge, and a very God incarnate, as they say, they would have him receive instruction not merely in the knowledge of things human and divine, but would also lead him through a course of subjects which in themselves are comparatively trivial, as for instance the elaborate subtleties of formal logic. Not that acquaintance with the so-called horn or crocodile problems can make a man wise, but because it is important that he should never trip, even in the smallest trifles. So too the teacher of geometry, music, or other subjects, which I would class with these, will not be able to create the perfect orator, who like the philosopher ought to be a wise man, but nonetheless these arts will assist in his perfection. I may draw a parallel from the use of antidotes and other remedies applied to the eyes or to wounds. We know that these are composed of ingredients which produce many and sometimes contrary effects, but mixed together they make a single compound resembling no one of its component parts, but deriving its peculiar properties from all. So too dumb insects produce honey, whose taste is beyond the skill of men to imitate, from different kinds of flowers and juices. Shall we marvel then if oratory, the highest gift of Providence to man, needs the assistance of many arts, which, although they do not reveal or intrude themselves in actual speaking, supply hidden forces, and make their silent presence felt? But, it will be urged, men have proved fluent without their aid. Granted, but I am in quest of an orator. Their contribution is but small. Yes, but we shall never attain completeness if minor details be lacking. And it will be agreed that though our ideal of perfection may dwell on a height that is hard to gain, it is our duty to teach all we know, that achievement may at least come somewhat nearer the goal. But why should our courage fail? The perfect orator is not contrary to the laws of nature, and it is cowardly to despair of anything that is within the bounds of possibility. For myself, I should be ready to accept the verdict of antiquity. Who is ignorant of the fact that music, of which I will speak first, was, in ancient times, the object not merely of intense study, but of veneration? In fact, Orpheus and Linus, to mention no others, were regarded as uniting the roles of musician, poet, and philosopher. Both were of divine origin, while the former, because by the marvel of his music he soothed the savage breast, is recorded to have drawn after him not merely beasts of the wild, but rocks and trees. So too Timagenes asserts that music is the oldest of the arts related to literature, a statement which is confirmed by the testimony of the greatest of poets, in whose songs we read that the praise of heroes and of gods were sung to the music of the lyre at the feasts of kings. Does not Opus, the Virgilian bard, sing "The wandering moon and labours of the sun," and the like, whereby the supreme poet manifests most clearly that music is united with the knowledge even of things divine? If this be admitted, music will be a necessity even for an orator, since those fields of knowledge which were annexed by philosophy on their abandonment by oratory, once were ours, and without the knowledge of all such things there can be no perfect eloquence. There can, in any case, be no doubt that some of those men whose wisdom is a household word have been earnest students of music. Pythagoras, for instance, and his followers popularized the belief, which they no doubt had received from earlier teachers, that the universe is constructed on the same principles which were afterwards imitated in the construction of the lyre, and not content merely with emphasizing that concord of discordant elements which they style harmony, attributed a sound to the motions of the celestial bodies. As for Plato, there are certain passages in his works, more especially in the Timaeus, which are quite unintelligible to those who have not studied the theory of music. But why speak only of the philosophers, whose master, Socrates, did not blush to receive instruction in playing the lyre, even when far advanced in years? It is recorded that the greatest generals played on the lyre and the pipe, and that the armies of Sparta were fired to martial ardor by the strains of music. And what else is the function of the horns and trumpets attached to our legions? The louder the concert of their notes, the greater is the glorious supremacy of our arms over all the nations of the earth. It was not therefore without reason that Plato regarded the knowledge of music as necessary to his ideal statesman, or politician as he calls him, while the leaders even of that school, which in other respects is the strictest and most severe of all schools of philosophy, held that the wise man might well devote some of his attention to such studies. Lycurgus himself, the founder of the stern laws of Sparta, approved of the training supplied by music. Indeed, nature itself seems to have given music as a boon to men to lighten the strain of labor. Even the rower in the galleys is cheered to effort by song. Nor is this function of music confined to cases where the efforts of a number are given union by the sound of some sweet voice that sets the tune, but even solitary workers find solace at their toil in artless song. So far I have attempted merely to sound the praises of the noblest of arts, without bringing it into connection with the education of an orator. I will therefore pass by the fact that the art of letters and that of music were once united. Indeed, Archytas and Euenus held that the former was subordinate to the latter, while we know that the same instructors were employed for the teaching of both, from Sophron, a writer of farces, it is true, but so highly esteemed by Plato that he is believed to have had Sophron's works under his pillow on his deathbed. The same fact is proved by the case of Eupolis, who makes Prodamus teach both music and literature, and whose Mericus, who was none other than Hyperbolus in disguise, asserts that he knows nothing of music but letters. Aristophanes, again, in more than one of his plays, shows that boys were trained in music from remote antiquity, while in the Hypobolymeas of Menander, an old man, when a father claims his son from him, gives an account of all expenses incurred on behalf of the boy's education, and states that he has paid out large sums to musicians and geometricians. From the importance thus given to music also originated the custom of taking a lyre round the company after dinner, and when on such an occasion Themistocles confessed that he could not play, his education was, to quote the words of Cicero, regarded as imperfect. Even at the banquets of our own forefathers it was the custom to introduce the pipe and lyre, and even the hymn of the Salii has its tune. These practices were instituted by King Numa, and clearly prove that not even those whom we regard as rude warriors neglected the study of music, at least in so far as the resources of that age allowed. Finally, there was actually a proverb among the Greeks that the uneducated were far from the company of the Muses and Graces. But let us discuss the advantages which our future orator may reasonably expect to derive from the study of music. Music has two modes of expression in the voice and in the body, for both voice and body require to be controlled by appropriate rules. Aristoxenus divides music, in so far as it concerns the voice, into rhythm and melody, the one consisting in measure, the latter in sound and song. Now I ask you whether it is not absolutely necessary for the orator to be acquainted with all these methods of expression which are concerned firstly with gesture, secondly with the arrangement of words, and thirdly with the inflections of the voice, of which a great variety are required in pleading. Otherwise we must assume that structure and the euphonious combination of sounds are necessary only for poetry, lyric and otherwise, but superfluous in pleading, or that, unlike music, oratory has no interest in the variation of arrangement and sound to suit the demands of the case. But eloquence does vary both tone and rhythm, expressing sublime thoughts with elevation, pleasing thoughts with sweetness, and ordinary with gentle utterance, and in every expression of its art is in sympathy with the emotions of which it is the mouthpiece. It is by the raising, lowering, or inflection of the voice that the orator stirs the emotions of his hearers, and the measure, if I may repeat the term, of voice or phrase differs according as we wish to rouse the indignation or the pity of the judge. For, as we know, different emotions are roused even by the various musical instruments, which are incapable of reproducing speech. Further, the motion of the body must be suitable and becoming, or as the Greeks call it, eurythmic, and this can only be secured by the study of music. This is a most important department of eloquence, and will receive separate treatment in this work. To proceed, an orator will assuredly pay special attention to his voice. And what is so specially the concern of music as this? Here, too, I must not anticipate a later section of this work, and will content myself by citing the example of Gaius Gracchus, the leading orator of his age, who during his speeches had a musician standing behind him with a pitch-pipe, or tonarion, as the Greeks call it, whose duty was to give him the tones in which his voice was to be pitched. Such was the attention which he paid to this point even in the midst of his most turbulent speeches, when he was terrifying the patrician party, and even when he had begun to fear their power. I should like, for the benefit of the uninstructed, those creatures of the heavier muse, as the saying is, to remove all doubts as to the value of music. They will, at any rate, admit that the poets should be read by our future orator. But can they be read without such knowledge? If there were anything novel in my insistence on the study of music, I should have to treat the matter at greater length. But in view of the fact that the study of music has, from those remote times when Chiron taught Achilles down to our own day, continued to be studied by all except those who have a hatred for any regular course of study, it would be a mistake to seem to cast any doubt upon its value by showing an excessive zeal in its defense. It will, however, I think, be sufficiently clear from the examples I have already quoted what I regard as the value and the sphere of music in the training of an orator. Still, I think I ought to be more emphatic than I have been in stating that the music which I desire to see taught is not our modern music, which has been emasculated by the lascivious melodies of our effeminate stage, and has to no small extent destroyed such manly vigor as we still possessed. No, I refer to the music of old, which was employed to sing the praises of brave men, and was sung by the brave themselves. I will have none of your psalteries and viols, that are unfit even for the use of a modest girl. Give me the knowledge of the principles of music, which have power to excite or assuage the emotions of mankind. We are told that Pythagoras, on one occasion, when some young men were led astray by their passions to commit an outrage on a respectable family, called them by ordering the piper to change her strain to a spondaic measure, while Chrysippus selects a special tune to be used by nurses to entice their little charges to sleep. Further, I may point out that among the fictitious themes employed in declamation is one, doing no little credit to its author's learning, in which it is supposed that a piper is accused of manslaughter because he had played a tune in the Phrygian mode as an accompaniment to a sacrifice, with the result that the person officiating went mad and flung himself over a precipice. If an orator is expected to declaim on such a theme as this, which cannot possibly be handled without some knowledge of music, how can my critics, for all their prejudice, fail to agree that music is a necessary element in the education of an orator? As regards geometry, it is granted that portions of this science are of value for the instruction of children, for admittedly it exercises their minds, sharpens their wits, and generates quickness of perception. But it is considered that the value of geometry resides in the process of learning, and not, as with other sciences, in the knowledge thus acquired. Such is the general opinion. But it is not without good reason that some of the greatest men have devoted special attention to this science. Geometry has two divisions. One is concerned with numbers, the other with figures. Now, knowledge of the former is a necessity, not merely to the orator, but to any one who has had even an elementary education. Such knowledge is frequently required in actual cases, in which a speaker is regarded as deficient in education. I will not say if he hesitates in making a calculation, but even if he contradicts the calculation which he states in words by making an uncertain or inappropriate gesture with his fingers. Again, linear geometry is frequently required in cases, as in lawsuits about boundaries and measurements, but geometry and oratory are related in a yet more important way than this. In the first place, logical development is one of the necessities of geometry. And is it not equally a necessity for oratory? Geometry arrives at its conclusions from definite premises, and by arguing from what is certain, proves what was previously uncertain. Is not this just what we do in speaking? Again, are not the problems of geometry almost entirely solved by the syllogistic method, a fact which makes the majority assert that geometry bears a closer resemblance to logic than to rhetoric? But even the orator will sometimes, though rarely, prove his point by formal logic. For, if necessary, he will use the syllogism, and he will certainly make use of the enthymeme, which is a rhetorical form of syllogism. Further, the most absolute form of proof is that which is generally known as linear demonstration. And what is the aim of oratory, if not proof? Again, oratory sometimes detects falsehoods closely resembling the truth by the use of geometrical methods. An example of this may be found in connection with numbers in the so-called pseudographs, a favorite amusement in our boyhood. But there are more important points to be considered. Who is there who would not accept the following proposition? When the lines bounding two figures are equal in length, the areas contained within those lines are equal. But this is false, for everything depends on the shape of the figure formed by these lines, and historians have been taken to task by geometricians for believing the time taken to circumnavigate an island to be a sufficient indication of its size, for the space enclosed is in proportion to the perfection of the figure. Consequently, if the bounding line to which we have referred form a circle, the most perfect of all plane figures, it will contain a larger space than if the same length of line took the form of a square, while a square contains a greater space than a triangle having the same total perimeter, and an equilateral triangle than a scalene triangle. But there are other points which perhaps present greater difficulty. I will take an example which is easy, even for those who have no knowledge of geometry. There is scarcely any one who does not know that the Roman acre is 240 feet long and 120 feet broad, and its total perimeter and the area enclosed can easily be calculated. But a square of 180 feet gives the same perimeter, yet contains a much larger area within its four sides. If the calculation prove irksome to any of my readers, you can learn the same truth by employing smaller numbers. Take a 10-foot square. Its perimeter is 40 feet, and it contains 100 square feet. But if the dimensions be 15 feet by 5, while the perimeter is the same, the area enclosed is less by a quarter. On the other hand, if we draw a parallelogram measuring 19 feet by 1, the number of square feet enclosed will be no greater than the number of linear feet, making the actual length of the parallelogram, though the perimeter will be exactly as that of the figure which encloses an area of 100 square feet. Consequently, the area enclosed by 4 lines will decrease in proportion as we depart from the form of a square. It further follows that it is perfectly possible for the space enclosed to be less, though the perimeter be greater. This applies to plane figures only, for even one who is no mathematician can see that, when we have to consider hills or valleys, the extent of ground enclosed is greater than the sky over it. But geometry soars still higher to the consideration of the system of the universe, for by its calculations it demonstrates the fixed and ordained courses of the stars, and thereby we acquire the knowledge that all things are ruled by order and destiny, a consideration which may at times be of value to an order. When Pericles dispelled the panic caused at Athens by the eclipse of the sun by explaining the causes of the phenomenon, or Sulpicius Gallus discoursed on the eclipse of the moon to the army of Lucius Paulus to prevent the soldiers being seized with terror at what they regarded as a portent sent by heaven, did not they discharge the function of an orator? If Nicias had known this when he commanded in Sicily, he would not have shared the terror of his men, nor lost the finest army that Athens ever placed in the field. Dion, for instance, when he came to Syracuse to overthrow the tyranny of Dionysus, was not frightened away by the occurrence of a similar phenomenon. However, we are not concerned with the uses of geometry in war, and need not dwell upon the fact that Archimedes single-handed succeeded in appreciably prolonging the resistance of Syracuse when it was besieged. It will suffice for our purpose that there are a number of problems which it is difficult to solve in any other way, which are as a rule solved by these linear demonstrations, such as the method of division, section to infinity, and the ratio of increase in velocity. From this we may conclude that, if, as we shall show in the next book, an orator has to speak on every kind of subject, he can under no circumstances dispense with a knowledge of geometry. End of Book 1, Chapter 10.